Hello, this is Julian with Coffee Reviews, and today we'll be reviewing the Nyanjuki AB wash processed Kenya from Nomad Coffee. And there's the bag right there. And Nomad, based out of Barcelona, Spain. And they're a coffee roaster that's appeared on this channel multiple times before. However, it has been over a year since they've last been featured on this channel. And they're another coffee roaster that, on paper, I should have enjoyed more than our previous reviews have indicated. And that's because they roast on the lighter side of things, as well as utilize the Probat as their roasting machine, which is why it's surprising that we've had pretty mixed reviews of them in the past. So when I did see this coffee at a shop out in Denver, it felt like a great opportunity to revisit them and give them another shot. So it'll be interesting to see how this one turned out, as this right here is day 37. And recipe we went with for this coffee was our standard recipe, which is a 16:1 water to coffee ratio. And the only difference from our standard recipe to theirs is that they utilize a 17:1 water to coffee ratio, but it also utilizes the 96 degrees Celsius, 205 degrees Fahrenheit temperature. And with this one, I preferred it through the V60, which indicates a more medium fine grind. Roast profile for this one, so as I alluded to earlier, they do roast on the lighter side of things. I feel like the easiest comparison is to Manhattan, as some of their coffees are very reminiscent of some of the ones I've had from Manhattan in the past. And I do want to say Manhattan in the past and kind of emphasize that, because since their transition over to the Typhoon, I have noticed some of their coffees being even lighter than experienced beforehand. So that's to say that it's reminiscent of some of the older school Manhattan coffees, which of course were also roasted on the Probat. With that out of the way, let's go ahead and start discussing this coffee. Day 15, first impression, and this day we actually opted for the Chemex, and it was surprisingly more red fruit forward than expected, which it's a Kenyan coffee, so on paper and in theory you probably expect it to be very red fruit forward, but it had much more of a sweet berry than a tart berry, with a lot more of a candied aspect than expected. It also came out in a much more caramelized sense, which all of this on paper is something that you would hope for when it comes to a Probat roasted coffee. And given that this was the experience, it actually really kind of surprised me just how well it was done in that sense. It still had plenty of the Kenyan aspects, including the brightness, a slight bit of savoriness, but for the most part, it was far more sweet than expected, definitely giving it a far nicer than expected first impression. Day 18, opted for the V60, and honestly had more mixed results with this brew method on this day, as there was plenty of the previously mentioned candied sweetness, but it was also highly concentrated in that Kenyan savory aspect here. So I kind of alluded to that in the first day, but this day seemed to have just a bit more of that savoriness to it. In addition to that, though, there was still plenty of the sweeter Kenyan aspects that I have experienced from a coffee this year, with much more of a sweeter red fruit component than still those tart berry aspects. So that's really selling me on this coffee, at least from these first two impressions. Even then, still pretty positive first couple of tries. Day 21, opted for the April brewer, and the coffee continues to remain on the cleaner side of things. And that's something that I haven't necessarily emphasized up to this point. Was I fully went into this one expecting it to be maybe a little bit too savory, maybe a little bit too Kenyan-like, given the roast profile I was expecting from this coffee, and some of my previous experiences with Nomad just in general. But that's why I was really surprised at just how clean and candied this coffee was coming out, as there was an abundance of those candied red berry aspects yet again, while providing plenty of the classic Kenyan brightness. And on this day, low savoriness, more noticeable citrus, as well as a slight brown candied aspect, so plenty of this caramel aspect to it as well. So enjoyed that day 21 mark as well. April brewer did seem to be a pretty good fit for this coffee. Day 23, back through the V60 with the more diluted recipe, so we opted for Nomad's recipe. And it's still nice, but not quite as robust and vibrant, with a slight bit more savoriness that was once again made up for by a candied tropical aspect. While it's still mostly this candied strawberry, it is also leaning a bit more into the citrus, as well as more of the classic Kenyan tart berries as well, which isn't necessarily what I was going for. We review so many Kenyan coffees on this channel that I can do with maybe one Kenyan coffee not being overly tart, but this one right here, having a lot of those sweeter red berry aspects to it, was selling me on it. So skewing in that direction wasn't necessarily ideal. Day 26, back through the Chemex with Nomad's recipe, and it's another nice day, but once again, not quite as lively and vibrant as we had experienced from our first couple of impressions. as this one has more to it on the cool down, including a slight herbal floral aspect, with a focus being on the slightly more rosy hibiscus-like attribute, which is something I often associate with Kenyan coffees in general, especially when they do have a fair bit of that herbality to them. A little bit more subtle as well, but still pretty nice all around, just berry forward in general. So even though I'm kind of being a little nitpicky with these last couple of notes, I just did notice enough of a difference to really make some remarks on them. Day 28, back through the V60 with the standard recipe, and the coffee was back to the best it's been up to this point, with plenty more of the previous red fruit aspects in a much more sweet manner. Cup continues to remain super candied forward, with it being consistent along those lines. A lot of Kenyan brightness as well, which I think is a selling point to some people, because a lot of people know one of the reasons I'm not necessarily the biggest fan of Kenyan coffees is because the acidity, the brightness is kind of lost on me. It's not my biggest priority in coffee. But if you have both of those things, a very sweet cup of coffee and a very acidic cup of coffee, then I do like the marriage of those two things together. So this is a nice selling point to me at this mark. Day 31, the coffee has continuously and consistently been bright and sweet as the candied sugar aspects continue to remain the most dominant aspect of the cup, with a sweet, hard berry candy focus and plenty of complementary citrus, as well as classic Kenyan red floral herbality with a very mild bit of savoriness. I'm not going to shake the fact that there is some slight savory aspects in this one. And day 34, final notes we have. The coffee seems to have lost a slight bit of its luster over time. Here on day 37, I kind of feel the same way. It could have also been that I had this coffee in a very hot car for a couple of hours. Just a weird side note on that, but it does continue to remain on the slightly sweeter red forward berry candy side of things. And the savoriness remains present and minimalized, with a bit more of it pronounced in the finish, as well as a slight floral herbality. All right, so let's go ahead and put up the tasting wheel so you can see what we're getting. And we have a lot of level 4s, so let's go through those real quick. We'll start with the finish level 4 because I can just breeze through that. We have a washed Kenyan coffee. The finish is almost always going to score at that level 4 mark. Yes, plenty of the red fruit brightness, the actually most pronounced characteristic to it, so that's what I was experiencing the most in the finish. Though towards the end, it did seem to have a little bit more of that kind of red floral, red herbal aspect to it. Sweetness, level 4. Yes, this is actually on the higher side of the level 4, and I really did enjoy the sweetness of this coffee. Kind of thinking back on it, we reviewed Red Plum, which was an unofficial review from Nomad, so that's why I don't necessarily want to lump it too much in with this coffee. But that was a very sweet cup of coffee. This one was almost on par with that. I want to say that of the official reviews that we've had from Nomad on this channel, this is the sweetest coffee that we've ever had. Really enjoyed the vibrancy of this one. It's the first talking point we had to it, and it was one of the most determining factors about this coffee, defining factors. Acidity, level 4. Yes, it didn't lose any of its brightness either. So lighter profiled coffee, Kenyan aspects, definitely expecting a fair bit of brightness, and this one married the brightness with the sweetness very well. So I really appreciate that about this coffee. I want them to be at least an equal measure, if not some more sweetness compared to the acidity. So that works really nice. Florality, level 4. Yes, and I don't quite recall whether or not they had any sort of floral notes listed on here. I believe that they did. And with me for this one, it definitely had so many of those red forward floral aspects to it. Typical experience you get from Kenyan coffees, so I have no issues with that. Oftentimes I like it, at least if it's not dominating the entirety of the coffee. Berry fruit, level 4, yes. And this is a big one, and one of the most important things within this tasting wheel. This was a sweeter berry. And oftentimes when it comes to these Kenyan coffees, it can be a little one note in terms of that very strong tart berry, which I know is what a lot of people seek from Kenyan coffees, but just having this be a little different. I think they have listed on here something like a caramelized strawberry lollipop or something ridiculous like that. It fits. I mean, it's a very sweet, berry forward aspect to it, and it does come out very candied, so I very much appreciated that about this coffee. Easily my favorite part about this one. Citrus fruit, level 4, yes, and it still balanced that out with a lot of the classic citric brightness that you can experience from these coffees too, and if anything, I would say that that's where the acidity aligned with a bit more than the typical Kenyan chartberry bright acidity to it, so still plenty of that as well in this cup. And then the final level 4, actually 2 more. Next level 4, we have the caramel, and that's going to be discussing the kind of candied sweetness of this. But in addition to that, there actually was a fair bit of a brown candied sweetness to it, which I will attribute to the Probat, and one of the main reasons I really love the Probat. It can give these coffees this slight kind of candied taste to them, even this brown candied taste to them. And that was a really nice added bonus of this coffee. Not something I typically experience with a lot of Kenyan coffees, so really like that part about this one. And then the final level 4 that we're discussing is the cleanliness level 4. Yes, a lot of people know that that's a very big deal for me when it comes to Kenyan coffees. If I'm going to put a Kenyan coffee as one of my favorites of the entire year, it must reach that level 4 mark, and that does insinuate that there's not too much savoriness in this coffee, because oftentimes if I get too much of that infamous tea tomato word, then I will bump down the clarity to the level 3. But for this one, it didn't have too much of that savory aspect, so it got that infamous level 4, and that's going to be right up there with the berry fruit as my favorite part of this one. And then we have a couple of level 3s. Actually, we have just one level 3, which is the body. And that, of course, is that classic Kenyan juicy body brewed with the V60, so definitely going to be on the more medium to higher bodied side of things. And then I think the last and only other thing worth discussing is the savoriness, which I briefly mentioned. Yes, and that is going to be something you would expect from a lot of Kenyan coffees, and having that toned down is going to be a huge selling point to me on this coffee, so I appreciate that being so low. And as I'm looking at this tasting wheel, I do think it's a pretty good representation of what I was getting from this coffee. All right, so my overall thoughts and impressions of this coffee. As far as official Nomad reviews go on this channel, this is easily my favorite coffee that we have ever reviewed from them by a distance. And it goes to show that sometimes when you are trying out a coffee roaster for the first time that you don't have too much familiarity with, you can miss out on some of their coffees. So just to kind of go over what we reviewed from them in the past, it was that Rwandan coffee, which we kind of just tossed away as a one-off review because it did suffer from the potato defect. We also had a washed Ethiopian coffee that was very bland and it didn't have a whole lot to it. So that one, again, I was not necessarily expecting that from this coffee roaster. And then I know we had one in a Right Roast subscription box, and I believe it was a honey processed subscription box. And that one, again, for me, it just felt a little tame. So I was fully expecting their coffees to maybe have a little bit more vibrancy to them, and this is much more in line with the expectations that I had for this coffee roaster the first time around. So experiencing this in the way that I did was really reassuring. And I've also had some coffees from them that have offered this level of vibrancy. So the Red Plum, which I've previously mentioned, and then my favorite coffee that I've ever had from them, unsurprisingly, was the Tipiga Mejorado coffee that they had featured last year. Tried that off camera and was really impressed by that one. So I knew that Nomad was capable of great things, and it was just a matter of finding the right coffee for me, and this one was easily that right coffee for me. This is up there with my favorite Kenyan coffees that we've reviewed this year, and I think it would be worth going back and revisiting some of the other Kenyan coffees that we've had to see where this one might stack up, because even though it's lost a little bit of its luster towards the end, the majority of the time drinking it, I was really impressed by this one. I do think that they did a wonderful job with this coffee. Type of person I would suggest this coffee to, I actually really appreciate what this coffee is because it makes it easy to suggest to a lot of people. So the first thing I can suggest is to your traditional Kenyan drinkers, because it still offers that Kenyan brightness and it still offers plenty of those berry aspects to it. Even if the berry aspects are a little different, they're not necessarily overly tart as you might typically expect from a Kenyan coffee. It still offers that, but in a sweeter manner, which to me is a huge selling point. Offers great clarity, plenty of brightness, and just a little bit more depth than I typically experience from a lot of these coffees, including that very nice candied aspect, that brown candy aspect to it as well. This is just an overall really enjoyable Kenyan coffee, and I think that's the best way I can leave this review. If you by chance had an opportunity to try this coffee, I'd love to know your thoughts and impressions of it as well. If you're enjoying the content, give this video a like, subscribe if you're not already subscribed. This right here has been a review of the Nyanjuki AB wash processed Kenya from Nomad Coffee. Thank you for watching.